Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Sunday Night Sitdown. I am one of your co-hosts, Miracle Jones, and today we have a very special one-on-one interview with one of our Slate of Eight candidates, Judge Mik Pappas, who is running for the Court of Common Pleas. We're very excited to be part of a coalition that is pushing for criminal justice reform and community engagement and education. And so we are very honored and thankful and grateful to welcome to the program Judge Mik Pappas. Welcome, Judge.
Thank you for having me. Very excited to be here.
Yeah, we're very excited to have this conversation with you. And so for people who do not know you, can you just give a little bit of your background and then what got you interested in the field of law?
Sure. Well, my name is Mik Pappas. I'm a magistrate or magisterial district judge representing 8 neighborhoods in the east end of the city of Pittsburgh, a neighborhood called East Liberty and the surrounding neighborhoods. I became a magisterial district judge when I was elected in 2017. Before that, I was an innocence defense and civil rights attorney. I had a multidisciplinary law practice, but these were my areas of focus. Before that, I worked in state government for 6 years before and during law school as a legislative aide to a state senator. And before that, I was a community organizer. I started off knocking on doors, organizing home child care providers into a labor union in South Chicago. Worked for Acorn, organizing folks into community unions in Newark and New Orleans before the flood. And of course, here in my home state, hometown of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, organizing voters in marginalized communities and jails all throughout Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh. And before that, born and raised in the community I now represent, East Liberty. I grew up in East Liberty when it was a much different place. These days, it's known for Whole Foods and Home Depot. It's known for, what's referred to as gentrification, rising rents. But back then, it was known for high rises and disinvestment. It was the epicenter of the war on drugs here in the Western Pennsylvania area. And this very much shaped my upbringing, having been raised in a household with an incarcerated parent, having lost loved ones to gun violence and addiction. And I saw in a very direct way through my upbringing how the law has the potential to shape the conditions in communities and the outcomes in individual persons' lives. So when I graduated from college, having been lucky and privileged enough to attend, my first thought was to join the legal profession, but to first come back to Pittsburgh and to give back to the community that gave me so much and put me in a privileged position to give back in the first place.
Thank you for that. And you talked about some of the changes you've watched, like in East Liberty. How has that created an awareness for you around some of the issues that cause people to become involved in the criminal justice system outside of your personal connections?
Sure. We as a society in the United States over-rely on arrest and incarceration to solve our social problems. That's why we have 25% of the world's prison population in the United States and only 5% of the world's overall population. And sitting in the perspective of a judge, you see how, we talk about intersectionality, but here you see intersectionality in the terms of issues that impact people's lives and material conditions. So housing, healthcare, education, all of these issues kind of compound and kind of pile on a person, so to speak, who's disadvantaged. And what ends up happening is they end up in the criminal justice system because desperate folks engage in desperate behaviors. And that's oftentimes what happens. And the way that we've decided to treat that or address it in the United States is through arrest and incarceration rather than through care and support.
Thank you so much. And you're talking about like care and support. And since you've been a magistrate judge, a lot of people always say when we talk about reducing mass incarceration, what are the alternatives? What can be some of the alternatives? But you have been kind of credited with creating or amplifying alternatives to incarceration, encouraging, landlord-tenant mediations. And so, from your just experience on the bench, can you talk about some of the ways you've been able to implement alternatives to incarceration?
Yeah, and I mean the question is like, why as a country do we rely on force to solve so many problems? Like, why do we throw force at somebody who has housing needs, or somebody who has, mental health needs, or is suffering from a disability or an addiction? And obviously, that stems from our long history of racial oppression that we've still been unable to untangle ourselves from. And so, the perception that because someone has housing instability, because someone presents as having a mental illness, that this makes them inherently dangerous somehow, and that we must respond to force in order to address whatever is being presented in that person. And this is just fundamentally unique to the United States, and it stems from a long history of racial oppression. We've seen recently reports released by Abolitionist Law Center and the ACLU in Pennsylvania showing the gross disparities in our criminal justice system in Allegheny County. And it's, I mean, you see it from the perspective of a judge, because you sit there at the center of attention in a courtroom full of people of color on one side and white persons on the other oftentimes. And so you bear witness to this very much as a judge. And since becoming a judge, of course, I had an acute awareness of some of these issues beforehand, but since becoming a judge, you're in the privileged and powerful position of being someone who can intervene, right, and who has authority to intervene to some extent. And so what you do is, when you know these issues exist and you see the role of a judge as having a role, or I'm sorry, a duty to intervene, you find ways to do so through knowledge of the law, through knowledge of people, and knowledge of the community. And that's kind of what's unique about me, in that, I didn't enter law school right after, undergrad. I deliberately wanted to lay a foundation of experience before entering the law, because I understand the importance of the law in shaping our social institutions that so much need to change. And so I've been able to kind of come into the position of being a judge, having a deep connection to and sense of how community operates in interaction with government and foundations, and just been able to kind of leverage that knowledge and those connections to bring a restorative approach into landlord-tenant matters, to bring a more equitable approach into bail proceedings, and really kind of just be in a unique position to follow the law, but help people who are looking for something short of the most extreme remedy a judge has available, incarceration or an eviction. That's probably not warranted in most cases, and it's not what parties are oftentimes seeking.
Yeah, and following that up, a lot of people have credited you with reducing the eviction rate in Allegheny County up to 40%, because you were creating these restorative justice approaches to landlord-tenant issues. And so, what are some of the issues that you see outside of landlord-tenant and criminal justice issues, like impacting Allegheny County, or not? Or what are some of the ways that you feel like people are not aware these issues impact the county?
Right. Well, my focus has traditionally been in criminal justice as an innocence defense attorney and civil rights attorney. I also practiced in the area of employment discrimination. I also practiced in the area of federal bankruptcy on the debtor side, seeing how economic injustice can really disrupt a person's life, their family, their livelihood. And so I think that a lot of it goes back to kind of economic insecurity and kind of the imbalance of people's economic circumstances. in Allegheny County and throughout the country, just to say that Allegheny County is by no means exempt for that. You know, one thing that I think is important for people to know, right, is that their votes matter so much because judicial philosophies differ. I was just reading recently some commentary where the stark contrast of judicial philosophies of two of our Supreme Court justices was commented on, and I actually have it before me here. And what these two justices were talking about, the contrast was made between Chief Justice now John Roberts and Justice Sonia Sotomayor. And they were talking about equal protection under the Constitution and kind of promoting a more kind of colorblind Constitution approach was Chief Justice Roberts. And what he said was, the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. And this was in response to a case about Michigan Law School kind of weighting based on race, so they made sure they had a diverse class kind of thing. And the idea of reverse racism, this theory that came out. And then Justice Sotomayor directly responds to that in a later dissent, a different case, saying the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to speak openly and candidly on the subject of race and to apply the Constitution with eyes open to the unfortunate effects of centuries of racial discrimination. So much different than a colorblind approach, Justice Sotomayor was promoting what I would call an eyes open approach. And I would probably say that I would side with the latter. I think that as a judge, we have this kind of duty to be observant and understand social circumstances surrounding the cases that come before us. So, for example, Justice Sotomayor goes on to say, as members of the judiciary tasked with intervening to carry out the guarantee of equal protection, we ought not sit back and wish away rather than confront the racial inequality that exists in our society. And this is coming straight from a Supreme Court justice in the United States. And so what the Supreme Court does for us as judges is gives us guidance, helps us understand our role. There's 500 plus magisterial district judges in the state of Pennsylvania, 46 in Allegheny County. There's 500 plus and perhaps more common pleas judges in Pennsylvania, some 40 in Allegheny County. And 95% of judicial business occurs at the state level. Only 5% of cases, and as you know, Miracle as an attorney, matters that are specifically reserved for the federal government is what comes before federal courts. Everything else goes in front of state courts. So with the Court of Common Pleas, we're talking about every legal issue under the sun except for a narrowly carved out set of legal issues that are reserved for the federal government coming before the Court of Common Pleas. So in terms of broadening landlord-tenant, broadening criminal justice, we're talking about child custody. We're talking about adoption. We're talking about something very important that you very insightfully spoke to in a previous conversation we had, which is orphans court and estates and assets passing from one generation to another. And I think that there is a great disparity in that because oftentimes I see, even in a summary building code violation case, which we handle as magisterial district judges, you'll see that an estate was never opened years after somebody passed for their one asset, like their most important asset, their home, their family home, to be passed on to a loved one. And it causes a lot of confusion in the law and in the community when folks don't have an opportunity to properly pass on their assets after they pass. And so everything from adoptions to juvenile justice to family custody to divorce to domestic violence to addiction to violence to everything that you can imagine under the sun comes, labor relations comes before common pleas courts. And so that's why it's just so incredibly important that we get reform-minded judges into these seats, because this year with 9 vacancies, it's an opportunity to reshape the court that comes along once in a generation, if that. Miracle, it would be the equivalent of replacing 2 or 3 Supreme Court justices all at once. in terms of how it could shift the local dynamic or the dynamic of our local courts. And we all know from recent history how much that was able to shift the dynamic in our Supreme Court. So imagine that happening at a local level, and then having this new generation of judges able to interact with the sitting judges and help them think through some of the challenges we're facing.
Yeah, and I think that especially given like the Supreme Court rulings around, Fourth Amendment and the application of the Miller decision, is very important that we elect judges. And in Pennsylvania, it's a very rare case of the Commonwealth. We actually get to elect all of our judges from magisterial to Supreme Court. And so for people who are learning more about what judges do, can you talk a little bit about what more you think judges could be doing now when it comes to issues of like mass incarceration and criminal violence and juvenile detention? Because a lot of times people think that things have to be a certain way, but the law actually allows a lot of flexibility for judges to create those interventions that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and that's a really good question. Oftentimes we get into this narrow view that judges just decide cases. But judges do much more than that. Judges are responsible for administering justice. And a lot of the injustices that we observe aren't just within the framework of the decision in an individual case, but within the framework of how justice is administered generally within a jurisdiction. And that's really important to take note of in the context of the Court of Common Pleas, because the Court of Common Pleas has the authority to administer justice as a whole throughout Allegheny County. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Judges in the Court of Common Pleas sit as a board of judges, which means that they make decisions by majority of vote. Very important decisions such as who our president judge will be, who's elected to a term of 5 years by the Board of Judges, such as whether or not we'll change local rules of procedure to create new specialty courts. A few years ago, a specialty court was created called the Housing Court, and that was done by a majority of vote of the Board of Judges to amend our local rules of procedure to create this housing court. And of course, specialty courts can be a great source of addressing mass incarceration by giving specific attention to individual needs in types of cases that commonly appear before the court. Another way that courts of common pleas judges can affect our local justice system, not necessarily the decisions they make, but in the terms of administering justice, is that by statute, 1 to 2 common pleas judges are appointed to the local jail oversight board, which has some role in setting policy for our local jail through oversight and supervision of its leadership. In addition, common pleas judges interact with court agencies comprised of thousands of staff, whether it be court offices themselves, whether it be the Office of Pretrial Services of Allegheny County, which sets bail policy, or the Office of Juvenile or Adult Probation, which sets sentencing policy, deciding whether somebody who's on probation will just get supervision or also get support. And then, of course, Miracle, like you said, judges have a great deal of discretion in terms of determining what's true and what isn't, who's credible and who isn't, what facts are most relevant to a case and which ones aren't. And of course, these decisions can or are not seeded with or protected from implicit bias, right? Depending on the extent to which a judge is able to mine their own deliberative process to guard against implicit bias. And so, in all of these different ways, judges have a very important role in addressing issues like mass incarceration in Allegheny County. Now, I would say this just to add on. Judges are leaders. Judges are not robed magicians, in the back of chambers or behind the bench making decisions based on their knowledge of law and magic. Judges are public servants with a responsibility to the communities that they're elected to serve. And so it's important to be present within those communities, which I've endeavored to do. But it's also important to acknowledge the challenges that our justice system is facing. We as judges have an obligation to promote confidence in the judicial system. But how can you promote confidence in the judicial system if you're not acknowledging the challenges and flaws within the judicial system and committing to address them? We need judges who will lead from the bench, from an era of deep reckoning with the justice system to an era of deep reconciliation, truth-telling, and reform. That's what this election represents, is an opportunity to shift into that next era.
Yeah, you're talking about shifting into the next era. And I want to also think about, because like COVID-19 has, exacerbated a lot of problems, has also, created a lot of issues with access to the courts, with people being able to come in and reschedule. And so I want to know, like, how is like COVID-19 impacting the way you're able to run your campaign and how you're able to engage with a lot of people, because you know the issues, you've been embedded in the community, but because of this global pandemic, some of the traditional means of community engagement really aren't there. So how has this pandemic impacted your campaign at the moment?
Sure. In terms of the campaign, it's been tough to generate momentum, right? Because usually you would have small events, large events. People come to meet you in person, to shake your hand, to enjoy, foods and beverages, and to hear directly from candidates. And instead, they don't have that opportunity. It's much harder to get folks to come to like a Zoom event or things like that. And so we've had to figure out how to safely canvass, safely launch volunteers, safely appear in person when possible, and just kind of rethink and reshape how we approach these things, obviously with a mind towards safety all the time. The pandemic has affected everybody and everything. And when we're campaigning, we have to be mindful that, maybe people aren't coming because you're not offering food at the event. Maybe they're not coming because they're super stressed and still dealing with the trauma of having gone through a pandemic. That's a big part of it too, is like people just like don't have it in them these days to pay a lot of attention to all kinds of politics, every single election. And you have to be mindful as a candidate and as a public servant of this as well. Our courts have been incredibly affected by the pandemic. I mean, just like everything else, the administration of the courts has been severely impacted. Access to justice has been severely impacted. But that's when you have a chance to show leadership, right? When crisis occurs, we expect our government to step up and to show leadership. When our court first closed back in, I guess it was in mid-March of 2020, one day we got an order of court and we knew it was coming to some extent, that we would be closing and we weren't sure we would open again. And that was a shock. We had to continue hundreds of cases, basically indefinitely, to a specific date, but we had to kind of estimate when the nearest possible date we would be reopening was. And I immediately recognized how big of a problem this was, particularly in the area of landlord-tenant cases, which are very time sensitive in magisterial district courts, and which implicate significant issues in terms of someone's housing, in terms of a mom and pop landlord's income. Most of the time in these cases, it is a mom and pop landlord, someone who has 10 units or less that they manage, or a low-income tenant, someone who is housing insecure and what they call NOAH, a naturally occurring affordable housing situation. So someone who would qualify for housing services or housing support, but doesn't have it for one reason or another. So is in the private market, but significantly limited means to pay. So this is the composition who's coming to court most of the time, and now has been completely dispossessed of access to the court, so to speak, right? They can't come, they can't file a case. If they had a case, it's getting continued. They don't know when they'll be heard again. And so at that time, and I'll just briefly tell the story, I had been working with a group of mediators for a couple of years, developing a protocol, and I would refer cases from time to time to the mediators, and we were working out kind of a protocol. How can you do this without engaging in ex parte communication? How do we do this while respecting timelines that are necessary for court rules? And I wrote them a memo after we closed, and I said, here's the implications in landlord-tenant cases. Here's Matthew Desmond writing in the Washington Post, expecting there to be a tsunami of eviction filings when the courts open again. And here, we have about 1,000 eviction filings every month in Allegheny County at that point. And now we're closed for 2 months, plus we just continued 500 some cases. So we can expect to have thousands of cases the day that we open if we don't do something. So of course the government stepped in through rent assistance to try to mitigate some of that problem. And what I did is I wrote this memo and I explained the problem to these mediators, and they really kind of embraced the challenge to the credit of community and went out and started raising money to provide landlord-tenant mediations. And to their credit, they've been able to start an organization called Just Mediation Pittsburgh. It now has 3 staff, multilingual mediators, 70 mediators community mediators throughout the county, all countywide. They have a 94% success rate for their mediations. And they really are, they went from becoming a complement to access to justice through district courts to the only possible substitute at that time, and still becoming a substitute. And I guess the vision is that people will have a way of resolving landlord-tenant disputes without necessarily going to the MDJ, without having someone who's a tenant have a public filing that there was a landlord-tenant case, which can affect their ability to get new housing, even if the case was settled or withdrawn. And so, one way we were able to reduce evictions in our district by 40% was by taking this kind of restorative approach, allowing the first hearing to be somewhat of a conciliation when possible, kind of taking a mediation approach. But now they're able to do that both on a community level through this program. So, stepping up and showing leadership is something that judges can and should do. Having these close connections to the community only help us do our jobs better.
And I really think it's very interesting because you're talking about being a part of the community and engaging the community. Another thing that you have been very vocal about is shutting down the Allegheny County Jail and talking about some of the issues that are happening there. And so what are some of the things you are thinking about implementing in the coming years to deal with changes in population and creating, new systems or new responses to calls around like violence or calls around technical violations that are landing a lot of folks in that local jail?
Yeah. So in 2017, one of my platforms was that I would push back against mass incarceration by ending reliance on cash bail, or working to end my reliance on cash bail as a magistrate district judge. And at the time, I was the first elected official, first candidate in Allegheny County to take that position. But since then, I'm just so proud to say that so many have aligned with that view. And I've seen the process in terms of how that occurred with other elected officials opening up to the subject and the idea, with community, with Miracle, yourself, and so many others demanding that we reevaluate our cash bail system in Allegheny County, and showing ways that we can, showing that there's models for us throughout the country and how to do that. And so just seeing how that issue has progressed, and the idea that was once, the idea held by a few becoming the majority opinion at this point, right? The idea held by the many, really inspired me. And the idea of having a plan to close the Allegheny County Jail first came to me whenever I attended a conference a couple of years ago that the University of Pittsburgh's Institute of Politics hosted. And it was about reimagining, local incarceration, jails in the 21st century. And it largely focused on the New York City model. In New York City, the council and the mayor's office have adopted a plan to close the infamous Rikers Island jail facilities by 2027. And it's really kind of an all hands on deck approach. They're looking at alternatives to arrest. They're looking at alternatives to cash bail through other types of bail. They've found there that judges rely on cash bail 50% less when they have other options, which I know would be the case here in Allegheny County. Shorter stays for probation violations. I think in Allegheny County, I'm not sure what the numbers are now, but we have an exponentially larger or longer stay for an average probation violation compared to the rest of the country. All of these things kind of accumulate and lead to mass incarceration, right? So how do you kind of pick each of those pieces apart while at the same time finding facilities that aren't geared towards incarceration and corrections for people who suffer from housing instability or mental illness or disability otherwise or substance abuse, and a different facility would be more appropriate. Unfortunately, kind of our approach has become to house all of those services within the jail. Right, so, but we're coming from a corrections framework, right? And we're starting with this corrections framework and then working down. And I think the idea is that the corrections framework is specifically designated for persons who there's no condition of pretrial release that would ensure the safety of the community upon their release, or someone who is serving a sentence for something serious or locally a sentence. And that's really a small portion of the jail population, or at least not nearly what it is now. A big part of New York's plan is to safely reduce their incarceration rate while working with the community to create alternatives that are more safe and more humane and much more cost effective, right? And so their goal ultimately is to have an incarceration rate that would be the equivalent in Allegheny County by 2027 of only having 650 some people in our jail. And so they're working towards that steadily. If Allegheny County had the same incarceration rate now as New York City, we would have, instead of 1,700 people in our jail, we would have 1,100 some people in our jail. And so if we had the same incarceration rate as New York City wants to have by 2027 when they close Rikers, like I said, it would be about 650 people. And at that point, the jail is largely vacant. And we'd have to be thinking about what the alternatives would be, And so I think that we should start thinking about that now. I think that we should start planning for it now, because that's the best way that we can truly gauge the community around solutions, rather than have kind of a systems-based approach to planning and preparation for that day. We'll no longer need to rely on the Allegheny County Jail. I would only note that the Allegheny County Jail was built in 1995, and that was during a period where prisons and jails and their construction was expanding throughout the country. I mean, we were in the thrust of the war on drugs. We were in the thrust on government disinvestment in affordable housing and investment in jails and prisons throughout the country, and in Pennsylvania especially. And so that's kind of what the origins of the jail was. And for many, many years, for 20 years, the first 20 years that our jail was built, the crime rate in Allegheny County was largely either staying the same in terms of violent crime and things like that, or falling. And our incarceration rate continued to increase dramatically over those years. So it's kind of been proven at this point that incarceration doesn't make us more safe, and it shouldn't be a solution to kind of all the other social problems that exist, in our local community. It can't be kind of this default solution, because it's just so harmful and so excessive for most problems.
Yeah, and it's come up with a couple more questions for you. One thing I want to say, just because a lot of times when people are thinking about going to law school, a lot of times people are like dissuaded and saying, you know what, you can't really make a difference if you become a lawyer. You can't really, fight for people and fight for justice. You're going to just be swapped up in debt and go corporate. But for people who are thinking about entering the legal field through law school to do, this public interest work, this social justice work, what are some words of advice that you have for them?
I would say that, everybody has doubt, has self doubt. Everybody tends to drown out the encouraging voices and focus on the discouraging voices and tend to think that there's more of those. But understand that if you follow your heart and think with your mind, that all the things you imagine are possible, right? And I think that's important for everybody to realize. I mean, look at me, who decided to go to law school, and within not too long after that, became a district judge in my community, and now I'm running for Court of Common Pleas. Having this foundation of community experience, working 20 years in community government and the law. Look at yourself, Miracle. I mean, when I watch, This Week in White Supremacy, or I watch kind of one of the shows that you offer commentary on, I'm always just so impressed by your knowledge of what's happening in our community, what's happening throughout the country and the world even, and the way that you can kind of analyze that within kind of what's relevant to people on a day-to-day basis, like real people. So I'm always just so impressed by events, and then kind of, talking about how that intermingles with the law, intermingles with social issues, and then intermingles with like things that just happened yesterday in Pittsburgh. So everybody's got a role in making the world a better place, and nobody should, drown out all the positive, supportive voices because they want to focus on negativity or folks who want to doubt what's possible. Because only you know in your heart what's possible, and so you got to follow that and then use your mind in the meantime.
Thank you for that. And so for people who want to volunteer with the campaign, learn more about the campaign, how can they connect with you? I know you have websites, you have social media, but can you just let our viewers know, just in case they're not already aware?
Yeah, and that's connected to your question right before that. The other thing is you got to work, right? There's no substitute for hard work. And, running for local office while also holding down a job, holding down a family, holding down all those things that matter to you in life, take care of your health, self-care. It's a lot of work, right? And it takes a lot of planning, and it takes a lot of devotion. And that's what this campaign has been all about. Our campaign has a 12-member working committee. I mean, these folks have dedicated dozens of hours of time to this campaign because they believe in it. We have a campaign manager, we have a campaign field director, consultant. We've aligned with two other candidates and formed a Judicial Reform Coalition, Lisa Middleman and Nicola Henry Taylor. We've been blessed to be endorsed by a coalition of social justice and economic justice organizations to be part of the Slate of Eight. We are creating a new infrastructure for making the type of change we know and need is necessary to have a more equitable justice system, a more equitable community in Allegheny County, right? And we're no longer going through traditional state gatekeepers to get this done. We're creating new systems. And so this is something that everybody should support. This is something that no matter where you are, whether you live in Wexford, Swissvale, Highland Park, or Homewood, you should be coming out to support this Slate of Eight. It is the way that we're going to realize all that we've imagined for our local community in terms of equity and justice. So the way to get engaged is to, number one, volunteer. We need hundreds of people, thousands of people on election day who will be our boots on the ground and leading up to that. We need folks to amplify our message on social media. We need folks who will cast their ballots, whether you're casting a ballot by mail or casting a ballot in person on election day. The problem with these judicial elections is that they are traditionally low visibility, low profile, but that doesn't mean they're low impact. In fact, this particular election is extremely high impact. And so we can't allow it to also be low visibility like in the past, with less than 20% of registered voters coming out to vote. And we certainly can't have communities that will be most impacted by this judicial election, marginalized communities, communities of color, allowing other communities to decide for them who's going to be their judge. We want judges who are going to really get us. And my one hope is that as somebody who grew up with an incarcerated parent, somebody who has lost loved ones to gun violence and addiction, who personally has had to recover within my family from the traumas of domestic abuse, that people will know this about me, and that when they come to court, they know they're finally getting a judge who really gets them. That's what we aspire for within our local court system, and that's what we have an opportunity to actually attain in this election on May 18th. So get involved, visit mikpappas.com, visit judicialreformcoalition.com, Google Slate of Eight, Pittsburgh, PA. Get involved, follow online, amplify online, of course, and of course, come out and vote, volunteer, be boots on the ground. Let's get this done, May 18th.
Thank you for that. And so our last question is a question we ask like all of our panelists. It is, what is bringing you joy? You're in the midst of a campaign, they said you're working to care of family. So you see a lot of the highs and lows of what's going on in the county. But to end on like a positive note, like what are some things that are bringing you joy in your life?
Well, I mentioned earlier, whenever I can catch This Week in White Supremacy, I try to check for that. Hasn't been all the time because my schedule is pretty packed with campaign stuff these days, and I'm not administering judicial business. But just to see you and others, Farouk and Jasiri, all just speaking plainly about what you see in the world and having space to do that, and the joy that you have in doing that with each other brings me joy. And I always, I'm sad I've been missing it, but I'll check back in as soon as I can. One thing that brings me joy is talking to people on doors about issues and seeing how much, status quo and common knowledge of what's possible really isn't that accurate. Like I was on the doors, knocking on the doors in Bellevue recently, and I knocked on the door of a 72-year-old white woman who wanted a yard sign, but she was a renter, so she instead elected to have a window sign. And I said, well, I have 3 window signs. Which one would you want? One says punishing poverty, or stop punishing poverty. And I explained what that meant. And I said, the other one says prevent family trauma. And I explained what that meant in the context of the campaign. And the last one I put out was end mass incarceration. And as soon as she saw that, she actually almost started to cry. And I was like, wow, I mean, this idea produced a visceral emotional response in a 72-year-old white woman, and she must have some experience with incarceration through a loved one, something like that. And I looked right at her and I said, yeah, that's my favorite one too. Here you go. And so something happened whenever I was on the doors in Wexford, way out in close to Butler County in Allegheny County, knocking on a door in the suburbs. I encountered a man who knew very well about autism and wondered about, he knew like right out of the talking point playbook for a judicial campaign, a four-minded judicial campaign. He started talking about how we're using jails and prisons in place of mental institutions and mental health hospitals because all the funding, dried up for them. They started closing down in the 70s. I mean, he's exactly right about that. And he wondered what would happen to his son who was autistic if he ended up being in the courts and caught a judge who wasn't particularly aware of how autism affects a person's behavior. And I was on the doors in Mount Lebanon. And I was talking to, the first door I knocked on this whole campaign was a door in Mount Lebanon where an older white man came out and told me about how his daughter had an opioid addiction and he hadn't seen him in so long, had been trying so hard. I mean, so these issues just transcend throughout Allegheny County, and you don't realize it until you actually get out and talk to people. And it brings me joy to recognize that out there on the doors, talking to people. And then, of course, knocking on doors in a marginalized community. We were out in McKeesport last week knocking on doors. And hey, it's a totally different conversation. You don't have to convince somebody that mass incarceration exists, in a marginalized community of color. Instead, the conversation is more nuanced, and it brings me a lot of joy to have those conversations too, because you have an opportunity to show somebody that I'm a candidate for public office, I'm a public official, and I acknowledge that these things are problems and they exist, and I'm endeavoring and I'm committing to do something about it. It just gives me personally a lot of joy to do that. And then at the end of the day, I come home and my 3.5-year-old and my 11-year-old and my wife are there, and it brings me a lot of joy to kind of hit the home front and to see them and their joy and excitement. So these things kind of just keep you grounded and make you realize that although it's a lot of work, although there's a lot of negativity out there, that it's all worth it at the end of the day, and it's what you're here to do.
Perfect. Well, with that, Judge Pappas, thank you so much for coming on to the Sunday Night Sit Down. We wish you the best of luck with your campaign. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being invited into this space and some folks taking the time to listen.
Of course, always. And so for those of you who are tuning in, you were just watching the Sunday Night Sit Down. It is a part of our One Media Network Sunday programming. If it's your first time watching, or if you're trying to get more involved, we have shows coming to you every day this week. Some of the things that we have coming up on Monday, we have the One Hood Power Hour. It's going to be Monday tomorrow at 7 p.m. We're doing an emergency roundtable conversation about election going on. And here in Allegheny County, as you may or not be aware, we're not having satellite pop-up voting this year. So you have to vote on May 18th, or you have to vote by dropping your application in the mail to vote by mail. That has to be in by May 11th. You have to register it by May 3rd. And you can drop your complete application as well as your completed ballot to the Board of Elections for a few days starting on May 12th. And so we want to just talk about what we need from our Board of Elections going forward, what we need to make sure that we have voter access and education for all of our elections, especially as like Judge was saying earlier, these off-year elections. And then on Tuesday, you may have seen some of the reporting about, livability of Pittsburgh. And so what does it mean to support Black artists? What does it mean to support Black women? So for what Black Pittsburgh needs to know, for Tuesdays at 2, we're going to be talking with a known artist and author, Daisha, who's going to talk about her article that she put out in the Forbes and her op-ed, and just talking about what does it mean to make Pittsburgh a place that's livable for all of us. On Wednesday, we have This Week in White Supremacy, also a show that the judge just mentioned, and we're going to be talking about a lot of things about white supremacy. But we talk about critical race theory in a way that shows what you can do to push back against white supremacy and violence, and how you can make your cities, your counties, your jobs, your institutions more welcoming and engaging and for all individuals. On Thursday, we have Thursday at noon, we have On Tilt, the state of mental health in Black America with Julia Spotwright and Mama Brown. So giving you some tools, some engagement on how to engage and protect your mental health, how to reach out for support and assistance, how to maintain. And so there's a lot of great programs that we have. We have that and so much more coming up for you next week. That was just a short synopsis. So we hope that you tune in. And like I said earlier, May 3rd is the deadline to register to vote. Please go on to Vote SPA if you have, we call it the Vote Spa. If you have any questions or concerns, also we had One Hood Power. We do have an election guide. So if you click on some of the links that we will be posting in the chat, you can actually go on and see what ballot measures are on in your area. Even if you're outside of Allegheny County, you can see who's running, so you can start to research and learn more about these candidates. But you have until May 3rd. If you have changed your name, changed your address, if you have changed your party affiliations, anything that is preventing you from voting in the upcoming primary, you can actually cure and correct that by May 3rd. So please make sure you're registered to vote by May 3rd. And lastly, if you are an independent or third party individual, even though you cannot vote for some of these candidates, what you can do is vote for a lot of the ballot measures and referendums. For this year, we have a ballot referendum about banning no-knock warrants, about stopping solitary confinement in the jail. There's also some statewide referendums about should we have, equality, and should we recognize equal access in our state or Commonwealth Constitution. There's a couple about ballot measures about should we allow a governor to create, these states of emergencies in times of pandemics so we can have shutdowns, or should that be something that the legislature does in a more political environment? So those are some things that are going on. So please, research these issues, research these candidates, and register to vote by May 3rd, register to vote by mail by May 11th, and vote on May 18th. So there's some of the deadlines that are coming up. And as always, thank you so much for tuning into the Sunday Night Sit Down. We hope you have a great Sunday evening and enjoy the rest of your week.